Hello and welcome back to another live stream of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I am joined again by John. And tonight, after almost a year, finally, we are honored to welcome SL Kanthan, respected geopolitical analyst and expert in areas such as Indo-China relations, BRICS, and technological impacts on geopolitics. He's here with us today to talk about Modi's most recent visit to Russia. SL, how are you?
Hello. Thank you. Very well.
And
So glad to be here.
I'm really glad you're here. And John, I'll turn it over to you. How are you tonight?
Doing good, Sarah. We're hanging in there. It's been an exciting week. Lots of big news, I think major geopolitical implications. And I'm extremely excited to talk to you, SL. I was listening to you a year ago at this time on this show. So it's a pleasure to get to talk to you tonight. And SL, you just have such a great way of covering the broad breadth of issues that are impacting geopolitics and the formation of the multipolar world. So I'm really excited to get to our chat tonight.
Thank you.
So, John, you wanted to start with the visit.
Yeah.
So go right ahead, jump into it.
Yeah, so I think that there's really two main topics. There's kind of two broad topics that I wanted to get to tonight. The first, of course, because we have you, SL, our resident Indian expert. I would love to talk about India-Russia relations and Modi's visit to Moscow and the implications for Eurasian politics. And then I also wanted to spend some of our discussion tonight talking about India's position on Israel. So those are kind of just signposting a little bit for our audience. But starting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Moscow, we saw the big bear hug from Modi to Putin a couple of days ago. And of course, a lot of kind words. And we also heard reports about cooperation and Russia's support to help India build 6 nuclear power plants. But for our audience, I think it would be great if we could just start with you jumping into telling us a little bit about the current state of Indian-Russian relations.
Sure. So I think it just got renewed. It's sort of the rekindling of the love between India and Russia. So this trip was really a watershed moment. I think this trip was the moment when the elites in the Indian, the government, they realized that the multipolar world is totally unstoppable. And that's where our future and strategic goals have to be. And they really laid it out very thick, So first of all, there was no need for Modi to go to Russia at this moment, right after his third-term election, because he could have just waited for the BRICS conference in October, but he really made sure that he sent the message by choosing Russia to be the first nation on a bilateral visit. And second of all, the choice of words, as you pointed out, he called Putin my great friend, and he said it's a very special strategic relationship, partnership, and they signed a lot of deals. And the photo ops were just like totally out of,
Let's look at one. Let's take a look at that. This is probably my favorite, the no interpreters walk. Very rare that Putin forgoes interpreters and walks side by side with a world leader. I thought that was a really, really important moment. What did you think of it, SL?
Yeah, it was. It was all very well planned to send a message to the U.S. and the world, and and then Putin gave this really rare award to Modi, the Saint Andrew, the Order of the Saint Andrew Award, which is a very big deal. And that order, it started in 1698. So it's a very special thing for the Russians. And also Jay Shankar, the foreign minister, when he talked to the press before the trip, he said there's only one constant in geopolitics, and that's the India-Russia relationship. Wow. One constant in geopolitics. So the subtle message was, the US-India relationship, it kind of goes up and down, but we only have one true love, and that's with Russia. and the thing was that India was kind of not so sure about Russia for the last 4 or 5 years, and then they just waited to see what happened in since the COVID days, and then the war with Ukraine. If you look at like the articles by the thinkers and social media influencers, the great think tanks over the last 2 years, at first they were like so blunt. They said we should just give up on Russia. There's no future for Russia. It's going down. It's going to be isolated, and our future is with America. It was all like rah-rah. And then they saw what happened. It's like, hold on. Russia is not losing the war. The economy is not crumbling. The ruble is stable. And, they became the largest economy in Europe. They surpassed Germany last year. And then they also became the developed nation with the GDP per capita of like $15,000 or so. So it was a very stunning revelation to the foreign policy establishment in India. And they said, man, forget it. The multipolar world is the future, and Russia is back again, and we need to go back to our roots.
Yeah, absolutely. And SL, I love that you mentioned kind of the watershed moment that this represented, because listening to the U.S. media today, you heard a lot of heads spinning about the fact that Putin and Modi seemed so close. And folks at the New York Times and Telegram were saying how this was really emblematic of the fact that the sanctions regime and the attempts to isolate Russia on the part of Western powers has failed, right? This is just clear evidence of that. But I think it would be great if you could speak a little bit more to just in what ways, you mentioned India and Russia's relationship has stayed stable and now appears to be on the upswing. But I would love to hear a little bit about how specifically India has bolstered Russia's economy and supported them throughout the special military operation, and kind of what that economic and political relationship looks like moving forward.
Sure. So the first thing is the purchase of, Russian natural resources, the oil. Because the Western plan was once, the Europeans, they stopped buying the Russian oil, then the Russian economy was going to tank. And what happened was, basically we replaced, the EU. So Europe used to buy with 2 million barrels of Russian oil per day. And that's exactly we're now buying from Russia. It was like a perfect replacement because before that, Russia was not a significant contributor to the oil in India. And now we get 40% of the oil from Russia. And, we're the number one buyer of Russian seaborne oil. So this was really stunning. And the US first threatened to sanction India. And then India said, well, listen, we're going to buy Russian oil and we're going to refine it and we're going to, send it to Europe. So it's a win-win situation. So then the Europeans said, okay, so we need that, the temporary plan, because we really cannot just fully replace Russian oil. So that went on. And then Europe said, okay, so now we can buy oil from other places and now you can stop buying the Russian oil. Then India is like, no, we're getting a great deal, fantastic price. And we also get to make the payments in rupees, a lot of it. So this was, sorry. And then the US made a big faux pas when they stole or froze the Russian foreign exchange reserves. And that really scared the bejesus out of the global South countries. And one of the billionaires in India, he called it, the terrorism. He called the US dollar as a financial terrorist. So, and the whole world woke up because of the seizure and weaponization of the dollar. And that also has started the BRICS expansion. So the US really shot itself in the foot by this war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine, and the following sanctions, because a lot of the countries, they started to wonder, well, hold on, whatever the US is doing to Russia, which is a nation with 6,000 nuclear bombs, if they could do this to Russia, why wouldn't the US do it to us? And, like in my country, India, there's a lot of pro-US bias. Because if you ask, if you are a smart Indian, a well-educated Indian who can do some great stuff with the computers, or you have, great management skills, what is the first thing you're going to do? You're going to go online and see what jobs are available in the US, what school you can go to in the US. And then if you look at the media, it's all, they just repeat, copy paste American media. Oh, so what does Reuters say? What does Bloomberg say? What does CNBC say? And the Indian Western media have no brains on their own when it comes to certain issues, like foreign policies and the global geopolitics. They just regurgitate whatever the US says. And then also, if you look at,
sorry to interrupt, SL, but I wanted to kind of dive into that point a little bit more, because that's a question I wanted to get to. We've seen the development and the facilitation of the multipolar world. The US has kind of shot itself in the foot, as you say, and is in a bit of a situation that's like a catch-22, right? They've tried to isolate Russia from Europe, break the energy infrastructure and cooperation between Russia and Europe. Russia's pivoted toward India. And on the point of Indians, or in the country of India being kind of a parrot of the West in many cases and on many issues, I would love for you to go into a little bit about why Indians in general seem supportive of Russia. At least that's anecdotally, that's kind of my perception, that kind of the people in India are more sympathetic to Russia. And how did that come about, given the fact that India has been under Western influence for decades?
So for that, you have to go back to the Cold War and the British, the colonialism. So when the British left they left India in the late 1940s, the the first sort of the natural response was to go away from the colonialist, the nations and the emperors. So at that time, the Soviet Union was kind of the North Star for the global South, and they were against colonialism, and socialism was very popular in the global South and in India. And the Soviet Union was very good in the sense that, like they would give the technological help, they would give some financial aid, food aid, but they would stay away from the internal affairs. They wouldn't do the propaganda, like we didn't see Russian TV, Russian books, or, like they would send Russian physics books and Russian math books, okay, but not the Russian propaganda books. And they were also very patient. Even now, so last year, Modi went to the U.S. and he, bonded with the Biden. They signed a lot of deals, and Biden said, the U.S.-India relationship is the most consequential relationship of the 21st century. So when such things happen, Putin doesn't say, "Hey, India, don't be so close to the U.S." The Russians don't say anything in public, and even in the background, they don't try to stop India, right? So they would just make a better proposal. They would say, "Hey, listen, we're not going to tell you what to do with the U.S., but here are the ways that Russia and India can work together, and we can find mutually beneficial solutions." So that's a very different approach, right? So when Modi goes to Russia, everybody in the U.S., they start to demonize Modi, demonize India. They give suggestions, they give orders. No, you shall not go and hug Putin, the war criminal, blah, blah, blah. So that sort of stuff Russia never does, and even when India kind of stepped back over the last 3 years from Russia, and the think tanks were writing really nasty articles like Russia has no future. Russia never fights back in the public. They're very patient. They work through diplomacy. That's a word that is so rare in the US, Like they have the NATO summit, okay? Why don't they have a diplomacy summit, right? You bring in 40 leaders from around the world and you talk about peace and diplomacy. They'll never do that, okay? Nobody has time for diplomacy, but they have plenty of time for warmongering. They would spend like $100 billion bombing the women and children in Gaza. But if they just gave $1 billion to Gaza, those people would love America, right? So like 4 years back, let's say the US says, "Hey, Gaza, we're going to give you $1 billion and we're going to build some amazing hospitals and schools and factories for jobs." People would love America, right? But they wouldn't do that. They would rather spend...
I mean, absolutely. It's crazy the extent to which Putin is demonized in the United States as this rogue actor, this person almost who's portrayed as unstable by the mainstream media. But when you actually see how he comports himself with these world leaders and on the world stage, he has this really cool, calm, and collected kind of approach that really is the real politique that the US used to engage in once upon a time. But to your point, our leaders have become, even, the quote liberals, have become so ideological in their pursuit of the advance of neoliberalism, unipolarity, control, and domination by the United States and the collective West. So it's when these events happen, I think it's always an opportunity for us to see the difference in how our leaders in Congress and in the presidency comport themselves versus someone like Putin.
Yeah, I mean, Putin is a brilliant guy, and I don't know where he got his smartness about geopolitics and the world affairs, because if you look at his the history, so he was not like an academic or a foreign policy specialist or world historian or anything like that. But when he came to power in late 1999 or at the beginning of 2000, the first thing he said, like he called China and India, and he said, "Hey guys, we are going to have long-term relationship," And he said with India, he said, "We're going to meet with the leaders once a year." So 1 year the Russian leader would come to India, and then the following year the Indian leader would go to Russia. And he really saw the potential and the rise of Asia back in 2000 when China and India were very, very poor, right? So China's GDP was like a 1/10 that of the US in 2000. And it was a very, very poor country. But Putin, he saw where the world was going back then. And then he had a regular meeting with the Indian leaders every year. It was really just amazing. And then it was only stopped in 2020 because of COVID. Then Putin came to India in 2021. Then when the war started, the Ukraine special military operation started, then in 22 and 23, there were no the bilateral, the annual summits between India and Russia. And I blame the Indian foreign policy establishment for that, because they were like, "Ooh, Russia invaded Ukraine. Oh my God, this has never happened in human history when one country invades another country. We cannot be seen in public with Russia." Give me a break. So then they sort of learned their lesson, and now it's back on track. But, so Putin in 2007, he gave a speech at the Munich conference, and he talked about the unipolar world. Oh, well, you guys actually showed that on your, the intro video. Yeah. So at that time, so nobody even used the word unipolar, right? It's like in 2007, if you go and read all the mainstream media, the word multipolar and the unipolar were not even common words. So now it's like it's the buzzword of the day. But Putin had the vision back in 2007, and he said, "Hey guys, this is not sustainable. We need to create a new architecture. We need to forget the Cold War mentality." And then before that, he went to Germany, and he gave a speech at the German parliament, and he spoke in fluent German. Mm-hmm. And then he said, "Hey, so let's be friends, forget about the past." And then he worked so hard for like 15 years to develop the Russia-European relationship. And he used to be very good friends with the German Chancellor Schroeder. He used to be very good friends with the Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi and the Austrian, French guys. And even the British guys were once very chummy with Putin. And then it all changed.
Right. I mean, it's amazing how you mentioned kind of at the beginning of the special military operation how Putin was kind of persona non grata, but things have certainly changed in the last couple of years, as I mentioned in one of my earlier statements. And that vision that Putin laid out that you talked about in 2007, they've continued working on it even through the SMO. And it seems like every day, a little bit more and more, it's coming to fruition. Now, India also became a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2017. And it's organizations like these, the SCO, BRICS, gaining international power. And so as this kind of multipolar world begins to take shape, how do you see this shifting India's role in geopolitics and kind of maintaining this really delicate balance that I've seen it do over the last several decades between East and West partnership? Do you think at some point India begins tipping a little bit more toward countries like Russia? And obviously we can talk about the relationship with China, which is long, historic, and complicated. Or do you see India trying to kind of play this middle ground like folks like Erdogan and Turkey have done? What's your sense of kind of the trajectory that India is on?
Yeah, so that is the $1 trillion question, and I hope that India makes the right the decisions. The key is to have strategic autonomy and sort of be neutral. So the neutrality is the way to go, just from a selfish point of view, because we never know, we can never predict the future, So like if you lived in the Soviet Union in, say, 1981, and you told people, hey guys, in 10 years, the Soviet Union is going to collapse, people would have laughed at you. They'd be like, man, did you have way too much vodka for breakfast? What are you talking about? And the same thing could happen in the US. Right? The US empire could collapse in 10 years. And we see the de-dollarization efforts happening all the time. And the dollar is the main pillar of the US empire. And you take out dollar, or you reduce the significance of the US dollar's role in the world, then the US is going to face tremendous challenges in terms of foreign policy and the economy. For one, the US is going to lose the ability to place sanction on countries around the world and the leaders, right? If nobody wants or needs to have the dollar, then the dollar just becomes an option. Then people will say, I mean, look at Russia, China, right? 4 or 5 years ago, like maybe 90 to 95% of the trade between Russia and China used to happen with the US dollar as the mediator. And now 95% of the bilateral trade between Russia and China are happening with the local currencies, ruble and yuan. So this is really a seismic change. And it shows the rest of the world that there is an option. It's basically the democratization of global finance. And so what happens if a dollar becomes, if the dollar loses its the hegemony, then the US won't be able to borrow trillions of dollars a year. So last year, Biden borrowed like $3 trillion. And if he had not borrowed that $3 trillion, the US economy would be in recession, right? So people don't realize that if you don't borrow, then you're going to be in a huge recession. What does that say? That's like you saying, well, if I don't I'll charge $5,000 on my MasterCard and Visa, then I'm going to be homeless. That means you're not a rich person. So that's what's happening with the US. And with the de-dollarization, if that really takes off, then the yields on the US treasuries and bonds are going to spike. That means the rest of the world will say, well, if you want me to buy the US Treasury, then I want a rate of 7%, 8%, because I'm not so confident about the US economy. And then it becomes a vicious loop, and then we see what happens like all the developing nations, they get caught in such traps. And then you'll be, forced into the austerity. And they're like, already talking about it. The IMF it issued a warning about the U.S. Debt. And then they also said that the European nations are going to face austerity, which means slashing of the government spending, raising the taxes. And those will be terrible. And at some point, the U.S. will be forced to shut down its foreign military bases. And there are no friends in geopolitics, right? So you have all these countries like Japan, South Korea, so now they're all like playing such mellow roles, bowing to the U.S. Yes, 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 Washington, D.C., whatever you say. But then once the dollar starts to lose its power, and then you realize who your friends are. There are not going to be many friends if you're not rich.
Absolutely. And I think we're already at the beginning of this, right? The smart and forward-looking countries are beginning to think about the future of the US dollar, not want to be so reliant on it, not want to be under the thumb of the IMF. Well, some countries aren't going that way. Countries like Argentina, for example, might be trending the opposite direction. But it seems to me that the countries that are really, thinking through the future of geopolitics are looking at the United States and then looking at the Eurasian landmass, China, Russia, and starting to try to orient their options toward some of these developing poles of power, if you will, these regional poles of power. But I know geopolitics is complicated, and you mentioned that there are no friends in geopolitics. And obviously, China has filled a lot of the vacuum or the inability of the United States to kind of continue its path of development. But of course, India and China, as I referenced earlier, have a pretty long and complicated history. And even today, we see from time to time some of these border skirmishes pop up. You see kind of it seems like a tense rhetoric, especially on the Indian side when it comes to how they view China. So I would love to hear if you have a few thoughts about kind of where relations between India and China stand today, and what the future of that relationship might look like moving forward. Are you optimistic about it?
I'm 50-50.
Like a realist.
That's better than last time we talked about it, though. So that's an improvement.
Oh, really? What did I say last time?
Last time you were like, no, India does not know how to act right. You were like, this is so bad. You're very hard on India, very India critical, but that's okay. You can be self-critical.
Yeah. Yes, I am very critical of my country. So the reason I'm now 50-50 from maybe, as Sarah pointed out, I might have been very pessimistic. So I think that the Indians are now starting to realize there is going to be a multipolar world. So we're not going to have a sugar daddy America that's going to help India all the time. So what happens when there's no sugar daddy America? Well, you're now forced to get along with China. You're now, So from that point, and China is now our number one trade partner. And, I just have to look around my home, right? Everything is still made in China. My laptop, smartphone, labs, Wi-Fi routers.
My phone's made in India.
Really? What phone do you have?
The iPhone is made in India because China wouldn't make it anymore.
It's not really made in India. It's just
Assembled
assembled in India.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you look at, we are doing the assembly now, right? So like, first of all, in 2020, when COVID happened, the American experts, they came to India and they said, guys, this is the golden opportunity. You are the next China, okay? The Chinese economy is now totally crushed by this little virus. And but look at you guys. You guys don't have COVID, like maybe it's your spices, okay? Like you have such amazing immunity. And you guys are willing to work at 1/6 the price of the Chinese workers. You are the next China. We're going to be doing everything in India. Everybody was like, wow, America, America, America. And then they tried to do manufacturing. They're like, holy cow, this is not so easy, And even the assembly, it's so basic, right? Like you just think you just get a bunch of people and then you screw the nuts and bolts. And that was so difficult because you had to like really manage the supply chain. You have to focus on the quality, the efficiency, the productivity, and we couldn't do it. So then we had to bring in the Chinese guys, fly them over and say, okay, so please show us your Chinese magic on how you do the assembly. So it's and that's the basic part, right? It's like the very, very bottom of the barrel part of the manufacturing, just the assembly. And then you think about making the components, right? So like if you want to make the screen of an iPhone, so not like that's really rocket science, and you need like billions of dollars of the investment, major scientists with PhD in material science and chemistry and physics, and you need fantastic factories, so it's not easy. And then you look at all the chips, how to make the microphone, the speaker, the right, and there's all like a rocket science. It's not like everybody can do it. And then there's also the infrastructure, right? So like that was a really sort of like the eye-opener for India. Oh my God, we need to build a seaports to get all these parts. And we need a better railway system. We need better, roads and factories and land. And we need to educate people because, not everybody can figure out the electronics, right? So what happened was that the last 3 years, the manufacturing didn't really take off in India. It's still only about 14-15% of the GDP, and it's been the same like for 15 years. So when Modi came to power, he had the right vision. He said, okay, we're going to transform India. We're going to start this Make in India, the project. And so not a whole lot happened, So if you look at the exports of the goods, we export about $400 billion worth of goods per year. And China is like 3.6 trillion dollars. It's so much bigger. So we have a lot to learn from China, and we're not going to catch up with China anytime soon. We're not going to make a dent. Even like if we would double our manufacturing, and if we steal everything from China, their manufacturing will go down by like 10%, right? And they will still have 90% of their manufacturing in place. and they're still going to be number one. And the U.S. is also realizing that, So the U.S. Likes to say we're buying less from China now, but the fact is those products are just being redirected through Vietnam, Mexico, and in India. So like your phone may say that it's manufactured in India, but if you look at the products inside, vast majority of them, they start in China. So I think that India has to figure out a way to resolve the border issues. And as I think it's, they have to figure out a way to freeze the issue, because I don't think they're going to be able to solve the issue. So maybe just freeze the issue and say, well, listen, we are going to stick with the status quo, and we're not going to change the borders anytime, and just keep the soldiers away from each other, so like at least 5 kilometers away, so if you see the soldier of the opposite country run in the opposite direction, but don't go near them. And
I think that would be a good strategy. It seems like the border issue, when it comes down to it, is fairly de minimis. It's more of a kind of a flashpoint in culture and news, more so than it has a significant impact kind of on the material and economic realities every day in India. And I think you made a great point. And that's kind of my analysis is somewhat similar. It seems that at some point, India just runs into this reality where it can't deny the fact that China's model of economic development, industrialization, is something that it needs to learn from, that it needs to cooperate with China to kind of model itself after China. Because I think that China has, when it comes to shipbuilding capacity, you mentioned, transportation infrastructure, just in building up its industrial base in a very sovereign way where the nation itself has control, that China is a much better model than, say, the United States, which can't even do those things here at home. So it seems like, to some extent, reality is going to hit India in the face, and it will have to kind of engage in realpolitik and make some of these decisions. But there's some issues, and I'm kind of shifting our topic a little bit now, but I want to make sure that we get to it because I know that our listeners will want to hear from you. There's some issues where India is still pretty aligned with the core interests of the West. And one of those big ones is Israel, obviously. Or at least that's kind of my assessment of it. And we discussed how India's geopolitical role is shifting. But when it comes to Israel, my perception is that most of Indian society supports Israel. But I want to maybe hear a little bit from you as to whether that kind of perception is totally accurate. Is it more the political class that supports Israel? Do the average kind of people support Israel in India? And then what is the role of the large Muslim population that we know exists in India as well? So I would love to hear a little bit about Israel as it pertains to India's domestic politics and their decisions in foreign policy.
Yeah. So a lot of it is, if you go back to the birth of India, it was the conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims, Pakistan, and then Pakistan's support of the extremism and terrorism in Kashmir. So the Hindu-Muslim tension has been a sort of the constant background in Indian politics. So for a lot of people, they don't know what's happening in Palestine. Like if you ask, if you do a poll, I would bet like 95% of the Indians have no idea about what is Gaza, what is the West Bank. They would say, oh, it's just a standalone country, West Bank and Gaza. And the Israelis are so innocent. They're just walking around and minding their own business when these Palestinians, they start sending rockets. So they view that as like what is happening in Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
So they had the sort of the natural, the instinctive fear of the terrorism. And so they support Israel. And also, Israel helps a lot with the military, the defense, the intelligence for India. So there is a lot of, warmth between the two countries. And also, like, if you look at, the cultures, there's a lot in common between the Jewish culture and the Hindu culture, So they both value families, education, and things of that sort. So it's like
it's just I actually just read a book called Hostile Homelands, and it was really interesting to me to watch that relationship kind of evolve, because India was kind of finding her independence when Israel was finding hers, and it kind of like this really interesting parallel thing where then India was like, no, you know what? Like, we're struggling against colonialism, so we're going to side with the Palestinians. And then it just got really weird, like throughout like weapons industries and arms trading. It was really, really interesting. And now they've kind of just like they're like very symbiotic almost. I mean, like India doesn't say anything necessarily bad about Palestine or do anything malicious to Palestine at all. It's just, and India is just India, but it's just a very interesting relationship that they have, because it's much deeper than politics and much deeper than I think that people know.
Yeah. So like one way to look at it is, like you look at, the Indians who live in the U.S., right? So you take the Indian families who are living in the U.S. and you ask them, so who are your best friends? Like who are your kids' best friends with, and who are you, the family's best friends with? And they would say, oh, my best friends are Chinese, Jewish, because they share the same values, right? So then that kind of transforms into geopolitics as well, when people can easily relate to one another, and some of the bigger philosophies and the outlook in life. So that helps. And then, at the same time, there are a lot of politicians in India. For them, the easiest way to get votes is the anti-Muslim, the anti-Islam. That is like the guaranteed way to boost your, the rating by 20 percentage points. So it's kind of on both sides.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the Muslim population in India, I'm guessing that population is pretty supportive of the Palestinian cause. Does that differ at all from any other regions of the world? Because we do see some difference in terms of kind of the solidarity and support that.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of that. So partly because the Indians don't know really what is happening around the world. So if you watch the Indian TV and so on, they rarely cover what is happening around the world. And so, and they don't show like any of the bombings and the death of women, children. They don't give the statistics. So I don't know how much the Muslims in India really know about what is happening, yeah. So I haven't seen like a poll or something official about that, but so far it's been very mellow. Like you don't see major protests or anything like that.
It's helpful context. I would love to. I don't know if you have any information about how materially, if at all, India supports Israel. Of course, we know that that's been one of the big calls for the Palestinian resistance and the axis of resistance and the supporters of the Palestinian struggle is to have a stronger stance economically, to boycott Israel and to kind of economically isolate them in their own way. And I think one of the more optimistic hopes is that with the development of BRICS, with the emergence of the multipolar world, and maybe the support that will come to the aid of this emerging Islamic pole, kind of weighted in the Shia populations in the Middle East and Iran and elsewhere, that ultimately this might shift other countries, particularly China and Russia, to take more significant actions to actually isolate Israel economically, or maybe even materially support the Palestinian state moving forward. But I wonder if that's, you mentioned how kind of closely identified the Indian population is more or less with the people of Israel. But at the same time, you mentioned also that a lot of people are just agnostic. They probably just don't really follow the conflict that closely, or it's an afterthought. So I'm wondering if you see, one, if you could tell us a little bit about the nature of India's support for Israel materially. And then two, if with this kind of development of BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the multipolar world, if you could foresee India kind of shifting diplomatically and economically away from Israel.
I don't think that's going to happen because it's not in our best interest to really go out of the way to antagonize Israel. Because if you look at, all the countries around Israel, right? Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, Kuwait, they're all kind of playing, neutral. So they're not placing sanctions on Israel. So why should India do that? They're like, hey guys, listen, okay, so I don't see you taking any actions. Yeah, and we're so far away. And well, Israel is not doing any harm to us. And we say that we support the two-state solution. So maybe we can help you work on the two-state solution and be neutral. But there's no reason for us to go and antagonize Israel at this point. And because if you look at the US and Europe, UK, Germany, France, and all the major countries are very, very pro-Israel. So I don't think that India would go out of the way to antagonize. And especially when, so it's not like, so you have to be pragmatic, right? The Palestinians, you feel bad at a very the human level, but from a pragmatic point of view, they don't have anything to offer to India. So I think, yeah.
Thanks, SL. Yeah, I think that makes sense. From my perspective, it will be really a question of how the chips fall when it comes to what's happening in the region. Because as you mentioned, in terms of diplomacy, it does seem like India is increasingly committed under Modi to kind of take this track of a little bit more kind of a rational analysis of broad geopolitical developments. So I think that kind of makes sense. But I'm also curious to kind of what extent, and I'm not sure if you really know or kind of have the details, but to what extent India supports Israel economically, or to what extent they're economically connected. Obviously, they're very, very close. A lot of major trade routes go through the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. But I wondered if you could maybe enlighten us a little bit on that.
Yeah, I don't think that Israel benefits a lot from India because we're not like big the exporters or anything like that. But India benefits a lot from Israel, especially in the intelligence, the defense industry, and maybe to work on a route in the Middle East. We heard a lot about that during the G20. So the India Middle East corridor to link Europe. And again, so for me, that's kind of like a pipe dream, because if you take a look at the logistics, it really doesn't make sense to me. Like you send a ship from India to the UAE, and then you have to unload the ship, the giant the cargo ship, and then you put all those on the trains, and then the trains have to go through like 1,500 kilometers across so many nations to a seaport like in Israel, like maybe at the Haifa port. And then from there, you have to reload it onto ships, and then you have to send it to Europe. So I think that sounds like a pipe dream. So I think there's going to be a lot of financial the cooperation between Israel and India. I think those are the easiest, right? Because if you have to build railways, if you have to build seaports, it takes a lot of time. But you can do like very good financial deals. You can do management deals. So, for example, one of the billionaires in India, he has now bought like a terminal in the Haifa port, right? So that's easy. The management part, the financial part, maybe stocks, mergers and acquisitions. So I think at that level, I think that India and Israel would work together very closely. And well, India will, as I look at with China, right? So China is taking a pretty much neutral, they speak a lot in favor of Palestine, but they're not really saying bad things about Israel. So I think that's going to be the future. I think for India, the focus is going to be Russia and China, because Russia in the long term is going to be a major supplier of the energy, and they help India with the military a lot. Like if you look at the tanks in India, 97% of the tanks in India are Russians. Russian tanks. And so Russia plays a major role, from the guns to fighter jets to tanks. And, like they do joint production. They transfer the technology easily. They work together in the development of missiles. And now they're trying to strike some really major deals, like joint the military. And India does not even have such a deal with the US. So the future is going to be Russian troops and the Indian troops, Russian warships and the Indian warships, and they're going to operate together. They're going to share the ports with each other for logistics, repair, resupply. So if you look at the long term, there are a lot of potential for Russia-India relationships. And if they can fix the China problem, the potential is immense, right? So just imagine with 3 billion people working together in cooperation and peace. It'll be just fantastic. And we have a lot of work to do, okay? So don't be fooled by the few Indians who are like rich and well-educated. We have like... we have like 900 million Indians in, stuck in villages, and they can't even read, write properly. They make like maybe $200 a month. So we have a lot of challenges to take care of.
Resurrect Mao, would that help? If we brought Mao back from the dead, would that help India? We could
No,
uplift
I think the Indians are very stubborn people, so they're not going to like go with one strong leader like that, right? I mean, because look at Modi, right? I mean, he's very strong, and all the mainstream media worship him, and it's all positive coverage 24/7. But he had a sort of a bad election this time, right? He lost seats, and he had to form a coalition. So I don't know. It's really hard. I mean, so I don't understand this psychology of India and what's the best way to fix the country, but we have to do it, and we cannot be just a focus. I mean, like people are always fascinated by fancy, projects. Like, oh yeah, let's bring in Tesla to make cars. Man, who can afford Teslas in India?
You can't afford them here.
Yeah.
So I can't afford one.
Yeah. So we have like 0.5% of the population can really buy Tesla. Why don't you work with the Chinese and make $5,000 the electric cars? That would help, like, a vast majority of the population. So in so many ways, the elites in India are always fascinated with this, like, the shiny objects, But the best way to help a developing nation is to do the boring stuff, like the Chinese did. You build canals, you build highways, you build railways, you build cities, you build new homes for the poor people, and you boost the agricultural productivity and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, just clean water, literacy, like these are things that, I mean, I've been to India actually before, and just to think that this is the fixation is on these shiny objects when there are, more or less 1 billion people who are in need of the basics. And so, yeah, Sarah, I think that they might benefit more from a Stalin figure. They might be more receptive to that. And I think if SL keeps wearing his CCCP shirt around, they might build the political momentum that direction.
We'll send them more shirts. We'll have to get them out to the villages. Little shirts, or shirts and red books.
That was a good shirt though, SL. I like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because the main problem is that we have a very fascination with the West, and that is the only sort of the books we read, the magazines we read, we listen to the Americans. So for example, like, if you bring in a super smart guy from China, a super smart guy from Russia, and kind of a dumb guy from the US. Okay, so you put, so you hold conferences for each one of them. And most Indians would rush to see the dumb American. They're like, wow, what is he saying? Let's take notes, So we need to change that mentality. We need to have, more of, the objective and pragmatic thinking. And because if you look at the politicians and so on, they make crazy promises in India, and they always fail. Like about 10, 15 years ago, they said, by 2020, every Indian will have a home. Every Indian will have electricity. We will have bullet trains. So nothing happened. We have 0 kilometers of bullet trains. So people are very salesy here, and then they believe their own sales talk. I'm like, no, you're just fooling yourself. Okay, so
yeah, I have a bit of a more optimistic note, and I know Sarah's going to kill me because I'm always coming on here trying to.
Yeah, but it's good. We can end on an optimistic note. It's good to end on a good note.
But I do think as countries like China specifically develop and become more high tech, and now you're seeing the Chinese exploration to space. They recently landed a spacecraft on the dark side of the moon, which was one of I think the first ever to successfully land and collect samples. And so it seems like as China continues to develop, it is kind of creating more of these bright and shiny things. And so the implication then might be that countries like India, other developing countries in the global south, who might not be as persuaded necessarily by the socialistic kind of model of development or these big kind of boring industrial projects, might increasingly begin to look at countries like China and Russia, who are developing high tech, not only in terms of civic infrastructure, but also military, and look at that and begin to think, well, maybe this is a model of development that we need to pursue also. So that's kind of my, one of the theories that I have as we come into this emerging multipolar world, is that the realities themselves will begin to rear their ugly heads for the United States and the West. And even these bells and whistles that we're so kind of obsessed with selling, right, when it comes to military technology for civilians or military, that it's just not going to have that same kind of shine at some point. So those are a couple of notes there. But also, SL, before you left, I know you're a pretty well-traveled guy, and I've seen some of the pictures of some of the travels that you've done. I think you've been to the United States, if I'm not wrong. But I would love to hear any suggestions that you have for an American or for our Western audience about where you'd recommend an American travel to, if they could. So I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts there.
Yeah, the Americans
stay home. Americans stay home.
No, they should go to China. Okay, it's going to blow the American mind away, and just the amazing infrastructure. You don't see any homeless people, drug addicts. It's safe. Just beautiful skyscrapers, and the subway trains are all like perfectly on time. There are no crazy people in subway stations. It's like the 21st century or the 22nd century. Like they have subway trains where the windows are like, the touch screen. So you can touch the window and you can look at the routes, the shopping, whatever, the information. And just 5G, so you can go to like a village and a mountain in China and you get like blazing 5G.
I don't have 5G at my home.
Yeah, see. So, and also the US can be a great power of peace and prosperity around the world, and it has to give up this idea of ruling the world. The empire project lasted for a century, and it was wonderful, when it lasted. But you just have to look at the Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire, British Empire, French Empire. They're all gone, And the same thing is going to happen to the US. And the US can be like one of the major, poles. And it can be like with China, Russia, and India, and Europe. Those could be like the 5 major poles in the world. And the US has a wonderful soft power. They have a lot of the creativity. And for all of its the craziness, the U.S. has like the potential to be a wonderful nation. So it just had to I would go read some Federalist papers, and so go look at.
Well, we just had the July 4th, so I was sharing the Declaration of Independence a lot with the leftist spaces who. And that's one of the things especially on the left in the United States, and people call themselves socialists or communists, will engage in so much of this kind of national nihilism. But I love the point that you ended on, because even though we recognize the real serious problems with the system of unipolarity, neoliberalism, and the way that it's kind of collapsing in on itself and decaying in really brutal ways that are also eviscerating and affecting the domestic population, that we do have these very strong qualities that could be real benefits and assets to a multipolar world that is cooperative instead of aggressive. And that really, those are kind of our only two options, is that we can go toward a proud multipolar future where we play a constructive role as one of several civilizational powers, or we can try to cling on to the bitter end to unipolarity, which will only result in more wars, more blood sucking from the domestic population. But this multipolar future, it's not a nihilistic one. It can be a very positive and optimistic one, I think. And you articulated some great reasons why.
Well, SL, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you tell our audience where they can find you and about your regularly scheduled space?
Sure. So find me on Twitter. The handle is Kanthan 2030, and it has the links to my Substack. And I'm doing geopolitics demystified, which I try to have 3 programs a week. One is my monologue on every Monday usually, and that's about some topic I choose. And then the second is like an interview, and third is spaces on Twitter every Friday. And we will soon have Sarah and John on our spaces.
Thank you so much. And I will go through the super chats really quickly. Our Wu-Tang guy, Wu-Tang. Danny Haifong, thank you for joining us. Make sure you like the stream or be banned from Danny's channel. And was it Southside Mike? Oh, no, Deep. Don't worry, Deep. We had this clarify for Deep. India was the first nation to land on the South Pole of the moon.
Oh.
They did it a year before China. Deep's here to make the correction. Thank you for fact checking us, Deep. And I hope the rest of you.
I think that China was the first to try to attempt to bring back samples. Deep can correct me if I'm wrong on X.
All right. I'm sure he'll correct you if you're wrong. Make sure you email him or find him in a space. We'll be back with Ritter, Dugan, Sloboda, one of the above. Thank you so much, SL. And it was great. Have a great rest of your night, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Ваше превосходительство, вчера мы также согласились на том, чтобы скорейшим образом установить мир, и мы готовы к любому содействию в этом деле. Я услышал вашу позицию, ваши позитивные взгляды и мышления, и могу вас заверить, что Индия всегда была на стороне мира, и когда я вас слышал, я чувствовал оптимизм, и возникли надежды на будущее, поэтому хочу вас за это поблагодарить, и также хотел бы сказать друзьям из СМИ большое спасибо.
Спасибо.